right, thanks, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll call today's meeting of the ISFMP Policy Board to order. Before I get into the formalities, I want to take a few moments to thank some folks. First, he's not here, but we want to thank Steve Bowman for his long service to the commission. I'm sure he really missed today's meeting on Menhaden. I'm sure that was. I'm surprised he wasn't there in the audience, but Steve has done a great job, and we'll certainly miss him. We also have another long-standing stalwart of the commission who's going to be leaving us, and that's Mike Millard, who will be retiring. Mike's been with us at least a couple of decades and has done a real good job representing the service, and has always been a good, rational, calm voice in the middle of some of our contentious deliberations. So we certainly want to wish Mike the best. Mike, I'll certainly allow you to make some comments if you'd like to. Raise your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Spud. Real brief, Kirby had a lot of nice things to say about everyone, and I certainly echo his comments. It's as fine a bunch of professionals as I've ever worked with. So thanks for the kind words, and you may see me in the back of the room sometime.
Thanks, Mike. We certainly wish you the best. And speaking of Kirby, certainly want to take the opportunity to personally thank him for all the support he's given me in my many years with the commission. He'll be missed. Lots of folks have commented about him, but he's gone. But I have a feeling we'll be seeing him again. Also, Savannah Lewis, for some strange reason, decided that to follow her husband and go to balmy Hawaii instead of staying in Metro DC. Can't imagine why she would want to do something like that. We want to thank her for her service. At this point, I want to give Tony an opportunity to introduce some of our newest staffers who are going to be taking over duties with the commission.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and you'll receive an email from me about all of this, but just to quickly point out a couple of things, we have hired 2 new staff members. The first one is James Boyle. He is actually on the webinar right now, and if we haven't scared him away, he will be taking over Menhaden. James hails to us from his recent graduation out of the University of Miami. From graduate school, he did his undergrad at University of Emory and has a background in coral restoration and advocacy through different diving programs. And then in February, Tracy Bauer will be joining the Commission's ISFMP team. We will be stealing her from North Carolina DMF. She did her undergraduate degree at UNC Wilmington and her graduate program at the University of New England, and she's been with the state of North Carolina for the past 6 years. So we're excited to have both of them join the team and get to know everybody. And then I also just wanted to make the announcement that Caitlin Starks is our new senior FMP coordinator at the commission. And I am looking forward to working with Caitlin in this new role of hers.
Thanks, Tony. We certainly look forward to working with our new folks, and congratulations, Caitlin. We look forward to working with you in your new role. So at this point, we've got an agenda for this afternoon's meeting. Are there any requested additions to the agenda? If so, raise your hand. Any hands, Tony?
No hands.
All right. Is there any opposition to accepting the agenda as presented?
No hands in opposition.
All right, then we'll consider it adopted by unanimous consent. We also have in the briefing materials proceedings from the October 2021 meeting of the Policy Board. Are there any necessary edits, modifications, changes to that?
I have no hands raised.
All right, is there any opposition to accepting it as presented?
No opposition.
All right, and we'll consider the proceedings adopted by unanimous consent. The executive committee met on the morning of January 26th, after approval of a modified agenda and the summary from the October 2021 meeting, we had a lengthy discussion about the role of the commission in offshore wind energy along the Atlantic coast. Several members endorsed the concept of commission involvement for the following purposes, and this is certainly not a fully exhaustive list, but this is just some of the themes that came out during the discussion. Improved and timely sharing of information about processes and procedures related to siting, leasing, construction, and operation, providing subject matter expertise regarding the science-based data and information used to evaluate environmental, social, and economic impacts, evaluation of how siting of infrastructure might adversely affect fisheries independent surveys, development of consistent approaches for mitigation and compensation, advocacy for federal policy development and or modification thereof that protects state interests, evaluation of offshore wind energy in the larger context of marine spatial planning. So leadership and staff are going to develop a draft scope of work with an associated analysis of the capacity of the commission to complete that scope of work. And we'll bring that back to the XCOM for further consideration in the future. So any questions about that segment of our meeting before I move on?
No hands.
All right, very good. Thank you. Then Executive Director Beal presented information on member state responses to the need for unused CARES 1 funds. A unanimous decision was made to make available unspent funds to states that have further needs with the goal of zeroing out the remaining CARES 1 balance by the deadline of June 30, 2022. The details of the XCOM's decision will be forwarded to NOAA Fisheries for approval prior to implementation. But this decision does not set a precedent for how any unused funds from CARE 2 will be allocated and spent. Executive Director Beal presented the draft revisions to the appeals process policy. The ensuing discussion identified the need for further modification of the policy to reflect concerns of some members. The draft revised policy will be discussed at a future XCOM meeting. The use of alternates for advisory panel members was briefly discussed. Commission rules and regulations do allow for the appointment of alternates. Therefore, member delegations are encouraged to appoint alternates to serve when the primary AP member is unavailable. And then our last issue was discussion of the near-term workload of the commission. It's possible that we may need to have as many as 4 public meetings. Obviously, that has changed as a result of this morning's meeting of the Menhaden Board, but we're still looking at the possibility of 3 documents that have to be brought out to the public for comment. And given the fact we've got a couple of new staff members and other factors, that's creating a bit of a strain on the workload. So we talked about some possible mitigative measures at the XCOM, which included changing the timeline for some of these FMP actions, or possibly having some board actions originally scheduled for the May meeting to occur at a special meeting to be held in June. So, we've still got 3 that we're going to have to deal with. And so we've got a little bit of a strain. So I certainly want to open it up to the policy board for any suggestions on how we might alleviate some of that.
We have Roy Miller and Pat Kelleher.
All right, go ahead, Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if I could ask a question regarding the first item you brought up, the second item, the unused CARES funding. At a previous executive, may I do that?
Yes, go right ahead, Roy.
At a previous executive committee meeting, there was a suggestion offered, I think it was from Pat Gear, that the commission look into using leftover funds to reimburse the commission for losses incurred as a result of canceling meeting arrangements. I'm just curious as to whether anyone on the commission pursued that, and if so, have we gotten an answer back? Thanks.
We didn't specifically address that. I know we did discuss how to possibly increase reimbursements back to the full commission for administration of CARES 1, and the general discussion focused around the need to really try to get as much of that money out to the member states and to the eligible parties as possible. But I'll bounce that back to you, Bob, and Laura, if she's on to address Roy's question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take a shot at it first, and Laura can fill in details if I miss any. Yeah, Roy, you know, we had talked about that at staff level, Laura and I in particular, and you know, we're in a financial spot where we could pay, you know, the meeting penalties for not meeting, and we felt it was, you know, equally as important, if not more important, to get the CARES Act money out to individuals that still needed assistance. A number of states identified that they couldn't fully reimburse people or make people more than whole. I mean, make people fully whole, you know, based on the funding that was available under CARES 1. So we, in this iteration, we decided not to pursue meeting reimbursement. And however, you know, there likely will be this similar discussion at the end of CARES 2. Once the states have allocated everything they can allocate, and we'll be able to, you know, pursue potentially more overhead at ASMFC if that's appropriate, and or reimbursement for lost meeting expenses because of COVID. So we didn't do it this round just so that we could make sure as much money as possible was going out to stakeholders that needed it. And we still have a placeholder for CARES 2 where we can look into it if we need to.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Any follow up on that, Roy? Good.
No, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, go ahead, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got distracted there for a second, but yesterday we did have a quick conversation on workload concerns, and you know, I'm not sure those are necessarily fully alleviated by the conversations at Menhaden today, but with Menhaden, striped bass, and lobster, I think we've got a situation still where workload is a problem. And beyond that, from a lobster perspective, now that we've had time to go back, think about the existing motions that were passed regarding approval of a public hearing document for lobster, we've got a time constraint issue here in Maine. So I do have a motion prepared if staff wanted to put it up, and I could read it into the record. If I get a second, I could give further rationale, because I think it would certainly help the state of Maine, but I think it may help with workload as well.
Go ahead, read that into the record, Pat.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the ISFMP Policy Board delay further action on draft addendum 27 to Amendment 3 to the American Lobster Fishery Management Plan to move back the public hearing to June 2022. The delay of final action on this FMP is to ensure that the public hearings can include a presentation on the 2021 stock status, ensure that the Lobster Board has a better understanding of current or new right whale rules that could benefit the resiliency of the lobster stock, and to allow for possible changes in the current COVID situation to allow states that will need to hold in-person scoping meetings ahead of any commission public hearings. And if I get a second, I can give some further rationale.
All right, thanks, Pat. Do we have a second? So please raise your hand.
We have a couple. I'll start with Dan McKiernan, Richie White, Cherie Patterson, and Dennis Abbott.
All right, sounds like you got your seconds covered there, Pat. So if you want to go ahead and elaborate a little more on the motion, proceed.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief here, Mr. Chairman, because I think a lot of the rationale is in the body of the motion. But you know, I don't have to tell anybody the importance of the lobster fishery to the state of Maine. It's a $1 billion fishery, one of the biggest in the country, and we're in a period right now of very high COVID infection rates, just like the rest of the country. It's really impacting the way we're doing business. And with an issue such as this, it has such an importance to this industry. I think it behooves both the state of Maine and the commission to give us some time to have face-to-face meetings with the industry so they're well aware of the situations that face them. Again, I think it'll also give time for the TC to compile all the 2021 stock information, which will be critical in presenting at these public hearings. And, you know, we have the right whale issue. We've got new right whale rules in place. We've got further conversations at the TRT happening that could bring additional risk reductions sooner than what is laid out within the biological opinion. And then we have a wild card of what's going on in the courts down in the DC circuit with 2 different lawsuits in play and potentially a third now with Max Strahan. So we don't know how those will impact the industry, but it's a wild card, and by having some delays till later in the year for any final action, it would certainly give us some additional information that may actually show some benefit to the stock resiliency that we're looking for. So I'll end it with that, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Pat. Any of the individuals that raised their hand to second like to make a comment about this motion?
I have no hands.
Okay. Any discussion?
Sorry, Spud. David Borden.
Okay. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question is it Pat, is it your intent that we will proceed with public hearings at that stage, or will we have to know the results of all of these different issues you've identified? And I just state before you answer that if it's the latter, we're probably going to have to delay this whole issue beyond that date, because it's highly unlikely that all of these issues will be clarified by the groups that are involved in them.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dave. I agree. It wouldn't be the latter. I think what I'm looking for really predominantly is the breathing room to hold some hearings or scoping meetings, if you will, ahead of public hearings. I would think, though, I think we will have not all, but potentially some of the information by an August meeting based on some of the timelines, both in court and we know we've got a 2025, an additional 60% reduction coming in 2025 that will certainly change the nature of the lobster fishery beyond what we know it now. But that's down the road. But it would certainly give an opportunity for us to understand what's happening in the courts.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, can I follow up?
Go right ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. I'm supportive of this concept, but I have to confess that I'm wary about a delay in this, and I think Pat probably shares this concern. The whole intent of this addendum was to put in place a mechanism that would give us a detailed footprint for the industry before the industry gets confronted with a lot of these development projects for federal waters. So it's a precautionary action, and if it gets delayed and we don't implement the trackers in 2023 as we proposed, we're going to end up losing a whole year of data, and those development projects are going to go forward. I think and we don't want that to happen. I don't think anybody wants that to happen. So I just urge everybody to keep that in mind when we reflect on the timelines.
Yeah, David, I do share that concern, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I do share those concerns, David. None of this is related to the tracker addendum. I think hopefully the states will be able to compile those questions and get them to Caitlin ahead of the special board meeting that is being scheduled. And hopefully we could potentially be on track for that timing. So I don't want the policy board to confuse this with the tracker addendum. Okay,
thank you. They do get conflated, put it that way.
I agree, they do. Thank you. I think it's good that you brought it up for clarity.
All right, thanks, David, and thanks, Pat. I think the second to this motion was Dan McKiernan. I think that was the first name that was read off by Tony.
That is correct.
Any further discussion?
Dan actually has his hand
Go ahead,
up.
sorry.
Yeah, thank you,
All right,
Mr.
go ahead,
Chairman.
Dan.
So I agree with Pat and with David, especially Pat's desire to have some in-person meetings, with some of the industry prior to the public hearings. I support that. Many of the items that Pat mentioned, we don't have control over, but one that we might have control over would be the calculation of the new index that is part of this proposed addendum, which are the survey-specific values for which that the board will be approving as to one or the other, depending on the decline of that in that index. And so I'm wondering if we do go with a slight delay, if through the plan coordinator, if we could get the TC to reveal some of those values, so that we do go to public hearing, we'll be able to have a fresh value for the stock index. And that index is a combination of ventless trap surveys and the other trawl surveys. So I guess that's a question for maybe Tony and Caitlin at this time.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Tony, Caitlin, y'all want to respond to that?
I'm gonna have Caitlin respond. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah, I'm here. I think it's completely reasonable to ask the TC to start working on calculating the index with the newest data. As we discussed during the lobster board meeting, I think there's a good chance that the data will be available before May. So I think we can definitely work towards that.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. All right, any further discussion on the motion?
Mr. Chairman, just to be clear, then, just for process-wise, we would hold the hearings in June, maybe a little of July, and then we would bring that public comment back to the board for their consideration in August, just so everyone's on the same page.
I believe that's the intent of the motion, but I'll defer to the maker and the seconder to confirm that.
I agree. That is the intent.
I agree as well.
All right, very good. All right, no further discussion. Is there any opposition to the motion?
I have no hands raised.
All right. I guess any abstentions or nulls or anything like that?
I have no hands raised.
Okay, very good. All right, motion carries unanimously. Thanks very much. Any additional questions about my executive committee report?
I have no hands raised.
All right, thanks, Tony. All right, with that, we'll move on to our next agenda item, and I'm going to turn it over to Deke for a report on the 2021 Commissioner Survey.
Thanks, Bud. I'm going to take a minute and get my screen shared here. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does everyone see my screen?
Yes, I can see it, Deke.
All right. All right. Thank you to the gentleman from the great state of Georgia. I'm now going to summarize the results of the survey of 2021 ASMFC progress. The survey of commission progress was initiated in 2009 to evaluate commission progress. It examines a broad range of issues related to the 2019 through 2023 strategic plan and annual action plan, and it's comprised of 16 rating questions and 5 comment questions. The 2021 data was collected from December 6, 2021 to January 6, 2022. And as you can see here, 28 commissioners or proxies responded this year. Here we can see the average across all scores throughout the time series. Overall, there's not a lot of variation from year to year, with scores ranging only about 1 point through the time series. The average score across all years is 7.73, and this year's score was slightly above that at 7.79. For this year's presentation, I'll attempt to frame the results not as a single data point for 2021, but to also add some context using the past 3 years so we can kind of get a picture of where things are going. The 15 rating questions comprise 5 categories. The scores for all 5 categories were relatively stable this year, with an evident increase in the progress category. Next, I'll run through the results for each category. Questions 1 and 2 evaluate progress to the Commission's vision, sustainably managing Atlantic coastal fisheries. The values in parentheses represent the 1 and 3 year score changes. So scores from questions 1 or 2 have been closely related throughout the time series with a correlation coefficient of 0.89. The second category is execution and results, and these questions focus on cooperation within and without the Commission and securing resources. There's been a negative trend for cooperating internally and with federal and constituent partners over the past 3 years. Scores for securing resources have been rising since 2016. The third category focuses on overfishing and managing rebuilt stocks, as well as engaging lawmakers. There is a positive 3 year trend in responses to overfishing as a metric of Commission progress in managing rebuilt stocks. Conversely, managing rebuilt stocks and legislative engagement have shown a negative trend since 2019. The fourth category considers human and fiscal resources as well as reacting to new information. Question 11, resource utilization, has the highest average score throughout the time series. Great job, Laura, with an all-time high in 2020. Question 12, reacting to new information, saw the greatest increase among all questions in the past 3 years. Scores for resource allocation on issues that can be influenced by the Commission has been essentially flat since 2019. The fifth and last category rates the Commission products, ISFMP, Science, and ASCCSP. These questions rank in the top 4 highest scores throughout the time series. Now I'll move on to the 5 open-ended questions, and I would note that there's a lot of consistencies in these responses from year to year. First up is obstacles to rebuilding managed stocks, and one of the major themes from this question surrounded cooperation between states, among commissioners, NOAA Fisheries, and the councils. There were also multiple comments on social economic implications of management decisions and challenges related to climate change. All of those concepts have been mentioned frequently in past iterations of this survey. Question 18 asked respondents which Commission products were most useful. There were a lot of positive responses here, and I'll mention specifically meeting week materials, ISFMP and science outputs, the website, annual report, and public comment summary. Question 19 responses were similar to past years, but I would note there was interest in getting back to in-person meetings, increased engagement with ACCSP, more information from the Law Enforcement Committee, and one commissioner commented about access to software and licenses. Question 20, as usual, there was a wide array of issues flagged as needing increased focus. I think I got almost all of them here in some shape or form. Some of the themes include allocation, reallocation, recreational management, climate change, internal and external cooperation, securing resources, social impacts of management decisions, and improving fisheries independent and dependent data collection. Menhaden, right whales, and meeting rules were also mentioned. Under additional comments, we heard again about allocation, climate change, working with the councils and in-person meetings. One respondent also mentioned concerns about the appeals process. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Deke. Great presentation. The survey is something that, I mean, obviously we'd like to see 100% participation, and hopefully, you know, we'll continue to strive towards that in the future. It is an opportunity to help give leadership and staff the input they need to make sure that the machine that is the commission is moving in the right direction and firing on all cylinders. So any questions for Deke on his presentation?
All right, I was waiting for a hand. We have John Clark.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Deke. I was just curious, seeing the numbers never seem to exceed the high 30s, and we're down in the 20s of respondents this year. Are you getting a response, at least one response from every state, or is this concentrated in one region or the other? Thanks.
Thanks for the response, John. It's a little hard to tell because the survey is anonymous. So short answer is no, I don't have a really geographical breakdown of who responded.
Right, I just thought that, aren't we supposed to shoot you an email to let you know we've done the survey? I didn't know whether you tracked those or not. Thanks.
Yep, I do keep track of that. I would say about a third of the people who fill out the survey email me though, so it's still pretty hard to know who filled out the survey. Like I got about 12 or 15 emails that the survey was completed, but 28 responses.
That explains it. Thanks.
Yeah, once again, it's uncertainty in the data. Seems like that's our perpetual nightmare, isn't it? So certainly, those of you who are responding, we appreciate it, and please, you know, ask others to do likewise. You know, they may seem just rather boring numbers, but it is good feedback for leadership and for staff, and I think it's certainly worth the few minutes of time it takes to do it. So. Anyone else, question or comment about the survey?
I have Lauren Lustig.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the data that was presented here. Could you please advise, or perhaps Deke could advise, what would be the number of responses if it was 100% of people responded? What is that number?
I believe it would be 45. We have 45 commissioners. Does it go out to proxies as well, Deke? So I guess if that's the case, it could exceed 45 if it goes out to permanent and temporary proxies. I'll let you respond to that, Deke.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's supposed to be one response per commissioner or proxy. So 100% response rate would be 45 responses.
All right, any other questions, comments?
I see no additional hands.
All right, thanks. Thank you again, Deke. We appreciate it. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about the policy on information request.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if Maya, I guess, Deke, if you could give control back to Maya, then Maya, if you could pull up the presentation I emailed you this morning, that'd be wonderful. Just have a couple slides on this doc. The document was included in the briefing materials, and you know, the bottom line here is that at the end of this, we are going, or the executive committee has recommended that this document be approved by the by the policy board as the policy that's going to guide future information requests. So Next slide, if you don't mind, Maya. Great, thanks. So just as a quick overview and a little bit of background here, the commission currently doesn't have a policy on how we handle information requests. So people call them FOIA requests, but I'm avoiding that term, and I'll explain that in a second. The commission obviously is committed to an open and transparent process. We've got a lot of detail in our guiding documents on public hearings and public process, and we're committed obviously to maintaining and sharing our meeting minutes and all the other things that we do. However, the commission is not subject to state and federal FOIA laws, so that's why I don't want to use that term. This is not a FOIA policy at the commission. Those laws don't apply to us. So we're in a sort of no man's land in the middle of state and federal government, and the laws don't directly apply to us. So how do we handle information requests that we get? And we do get them on a somewhat regular basis, and we've been sort of doing it ad hoc over time, and we figured it probably makes some sense to really formalize a policy so that everyone knows what to expect if they make a request at the commission. And as I said, the majority of the information that people ask for is actually already on our website. Tina, for a lot of them, just sends them a link and says, well, here's what you're looking for, you're all set. If you want anything else, let us know. So most of the information requests that we get, we can easily dispense of just by sending them to places on the website and letting them know what's available if they were unable to find certain things on the website. Next slide, please, Maya. So the way this policy presents information requests and the way they be handled in the future is that any individual that wanted to get some information that they can't find on a website or just from the commission, they would send an email to info@asmfc.org. And within 5 days of getting that email, we would acknowledge the receipt of the email and let them know of a reasonable timeline of how we would respond and what we'd respond with. And one of the pieces of that response will likely be that if the request is going to take more than 2 hours of staff time, we will charge for staff time, copying, mailing, whatever it may be. Hopefully we're beyond the time of actually copying hard documents and mailing and that sort of thing. But people want old documents, or maybe some scanning time or something like that. But the notion of charging for information requests is standard in a lot of FOIA requests, because depending on how they're worded, they can really eat up a lot of time. And in that acknowledgement of the request, we would provide an estimate of costs, and based on that estimate of cost, the requester could say, yep, go ahead with that review, or that information request, I'm comfortable with the cost. They could scale back their request and we could reissue another estimate, or they could say, well, you know what, actually, based on those costs, I'm not that interested and I don't want that information anymore. So that will be at the discretion of the requesters if they pay it or don't pay it. And then one common theme of, again in a lot of other policies is that we will not create new records. And what that means is, if a certain way of looking at information at the commission doesn't exist, we're not going to go and do new analysis necessarily for somebody that requested. So if someone chimed in and said, hey, can you go back through the 80,000 comments you got on Menhaden and tell me a state-by-state breakdown of where they all came from, or all the ones that, whatever, something wacky like which ones came from the Mountain Time Zone or whatever it might be. We're not going to necessarily go back and look through each of the records and do a new report or new analysis for individuals that request it. We would share all the Menhaden comments if anybody wanted them, and they can do their own work on it, but we wouldn't create a new record or a new report for somebody that requested it. Next slide, Maya. Data limitations. So obviously part of this information request is what, we try to share as much as we can. However, there's always limitations on what can be shared and what can't be shared. And one of the things that we all deal with all the time is confidential data. State and federal laws define what is confidential data. And we've been wrestling with this, and ACCSP has a policy on this. And this is a common theme among requests that you all get at the state and federal level all the time. So what our practice has been, and what this policy proposes to formalize, is that anytime we get a data request, we're going to forward that request to the original data collector. So if somebody is interested in whatever, horseshoe crab landings in Georgia, and that data is confidential, we'd forward that question to Doug Haymans and say, we got this request, and this is data that was originally collected by your state, and let that state decide what is available, what's not available. That's the one way we can assure that we don't violate any of the state or federal data confidentiality rules. Next slide, please, ma'am. And document limitations. Again, not all documents can be shared and not all information can be shared. And this policy spells out that, we may restrict access to other information, and certain things like pre-decisional, technical, or policy documents will not be shared. And that's a practice that we've always employed. It is in our technical guidance document. So technical committees or stock assessment committee, for example, is developing a new stock assessment, and they've got working drafts kind of bouncing between members of that committee. We don't share those because there's been a number of instances where those sort of interim drafts and non-completed drafts people have run with them, and the interim information and non-final information shows up in news articles and other things, and it's not the final answer. It's not peer-reviewed science. So that's our how we've handled it in the past, and we'll do that again. Also, documents that can't be or won't be shared are attorney-client privileged documents, obviously, and personal and personnel information. If someone said, "Hey, I would like to have all the home addresses and cell phone numbers of commission staff," we're not going to provide that to somebody making a request like that. So that's all private, personal information. So, and the document spells out that any questions about what documents can and can't be shared will be resolved by me, the executive director, and legal consulting with the commission attorney. Excuse me. So this document strives to be as fair and open as we can be, but there are some things that just we're unable to share. And then the next slide, please. And where we go from here is, hopefully, as I mentioned, the executive committee has reviewed this a few times and updated it, and they're recommending that it be approved by the policy board. One of the caveats in the last paragraph in the document is that, kind of being open with the public and letting anyone know what to expect, and that if you send a letter or a public comment or something to ASMSC, it may be subject to this new policy and may be shared with people if somebody asks for it. We have had people in the past that say, "Hey, can I see any email that went from this industry representative to a staff person," or whatever it is. And those documents in the past, if there's nothing confidential in there, we'll generally share those letters that bounce back and forth between staff and industry or NGOs or whoever it might be. And if this document's approved, what we do is, add it to our website so the public knows our policy, and that would be the document that does guide how future information requests are handled. So that's a little bit of a lengthy presentation, Spud, but I know the executive committee had talked about it quite a bit, but many members of the full policy board hadn't seen it before. So I thought it was worthwhile to go through a little bit of detail on this document, and happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and I agree. I'm glad you took the time to go into the details, because it is important, and it reflects greatly on the commission's integrity and principles of operation on how we interact with information requests. So, at this point, anybody have any questions for Bob or comments?
I have David Borden followed by Lynn Fagley.
Go ahead, David.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bob, will the policy stop individuals from accessing their own data? Confidential data?
No, David, if a state has a policy or the federal government has a policy where individuals can access their own data, we would honor that, but we would most likely bounce that request back to the state or the federal agency that originally collected that data. So we would not share that data directly. We would, if somebody from Rhode Island, an individual wanted, landings data or whatever it might be, we would forward them to Rhode Island and ask Rhode Island to, be the gatekeeper on that data.
All right. I just note just for your information, I've already been asked that about tracker information by the industry, whether or not they're going to be able to access their own data. So the states might want to think about that because the industry, at least some of the members of the industry that I've talked to, would think that it would be an advantage to be able to get that type of information on their own boats. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Go ahead, Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually had a comment, and I had two questions, if I may. The first comment was, I'm so glad for the element that you're not producing new records or analyses. I think that's super, super important. So that's good. And my first question is, when you forward a data request to the original collector, so in your example about Georgia, and you send the requester's request to Georgia, who is the state responding to? Are they responding to the commission, or are they responding to the requester directly?
I think it would be good to take the commission out as sort of the middle person here and have the state directly responding to the individual in case there's any questions and back and forth. I don't, I can rephrase it and say we're happy to be in the middle of that discussion and that transaction, but it may be more efficient if the state just goes directly to the individual making the request.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just curious what your thoughts were there. So I have no issues with that. And then my second question, if I may, was just a quick curiosity question. How many of these requests are you getting, per month or per year? So what's the volume like for you guys?
Yeah, it's a good question, and like probably all of you, it kind of comes in peaks and valleys, and there's different times where we get some. We don't deal with a lot. I don't know, half a dozen a year maybe, or something like that. We do get a lot of requests just for, as I mentioned, kind of simple things, meeting minutes or audio, the recordings of meetings and that sort of thing. And Tina handles those, really quickly because they're all available on the website. So, there's very few, half a dozen a year would be a lot of information requests that would bubble up to where we'd have to apply this policy and actually refuse to or filter what we're able to share with the public. Most things we can quickly respond to them and give them what they need, and we can move on pretty quickly. But there are a few every year that would have to, we'd have to apply this policy and filter out what we can and cannot provide.
All right, any further questions, comments for Bob?
No additional hands.
At this point, is there any further interest in querying? If not, I'll entertain a motion from the policy board to approve the request for public information policy as been presented and discussed. Someone like to make that motion and second?
I have Pat Kelleher.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
And a second
motion.
Bill. I'm not sure we have a motion to Maya, so she may have to type one up. But we do. Ish.
There you go, pretty simple. So we have a motion by Pat Kelleher and second by who? Missed that.
Mel Bell.
Mel Bell. All right. Any discussion on the motion?
Mr. Chair, if I could just, I think you said as presented today, so if we could add that to the end.
Yes.
Thank you, Maya.
Okay.
I have no hands raised.
Any opposition to the motion?
I have no hands raised.
All right, we'll consider the motion approved by unanimous consent. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Bob, and everyone for the work on this. Again, it's one of those things we probably won't have to use it a lot, but it's nice to have it when you do need it. Kind of like that fire extinguisher in your kitchen cabinet. So, all right, with that, we'll move along. Our next agenda item is update on East Coast climate change scenario planning, and I'll turn that one over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to have Maya pull up my slides. Thanks, Maya. I'm going to try to go through some of this faster than I initially planned. given the timing of the day, but some parts I'm going to stay a little detailed. As you all are aware, the three councils, the commission and NOAA Fisheries are jointly working on the East Coast climate change scenario planning. As a reminder, scenario planning is a structured process to explore and describe plausible futures in a context of uncontrollable and uncertain conditions, where the overall goal is to identify the best ways to adapt and respond to be better prepared for a range of possible future conditions. Next slide, Maya. Today in my presentation, I'm going to describe the work undertaken in the scoping phase of the document, as well as provide some information on our next steps in our exploration phase. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick reminder of the different phases that we are moving through. And the scoping phase was conducted last summer in the fall. Next slide, please. And the purpose of this scoping was to introduce and explain the initiative, received input about the draft project objectives, the focus and expected outcomes of our project, and we also invited ideas from a broad range of stakeholders about the factors and issues. Next slide, please. As part of the scoping phase, we did a series of webinars to introduce the topic, and then we did a follow-up online questionnaire. In the online questionnaire, we asked participants about the project objectives and outcomes, factors that shaped change, and suggested actions and other advice for conducting the process. A lot of the questions that we asked were open-ended. We received 383 responses from all the different regions and a wide range of stakeholders. We did a coding analysis of the questionnaire responses to see whether participants thought adjustments were needed to the project objectives and what factors would be most important to include in the scenario analysis. Next slide, please. So from the scoping process, the core team identified 5 key insights that are further described in the scoping summary report. And that scoping summary report can be found on the scenario planning webpage, which is hosted by the Mid-Atlantic Council. And there is a link to that in the meeting overview in your meeting materials. So first, we found that there's a lot of interest in this subject. We had a lot of participants in the webinars and the online questionnaire. The majority of the participants recognized that climate change would affect fisheries in the coming years and were supportive of efforts to help stakeholders prepare for change. Second, we heard that stakeholders, particularly on the webinars, about how they're already seeing the effects of climate change in many aspects of fisheries and coastal life. There are a lot of interesting examples that will be included in the report, but many of them centered around the observations of changes in species distribution, availability, and productivity. Third, there was general support for the project objectives, some with comments and suggestions for change. Some minor adjustments to the project objectives were made based on this feedback, and I'll show those in a couple slides. Fourth, the stakeholders identified a broad range of factors that might shape East Coast fisheries over the next 20 years. We found it interesting that each region and stakeholder group, while certainly having some unique experiences, had very similar overall perspectives about climate change and how it might shape the future of fisheries. We're going to use this input in our next phase of the initiative. And then finally, in the next phase of the initiative, we're going to try to strike a balance between focus and scope, meaning that there's recognition of a wide range of scope of this exercise and the importance of gathering and engaging wide-ranging input from in the process. However, there's also the recognition that in order to address the central questions of management and governance, it's going to, at some point, require more focused discussions. Next slide, and this is just to note that that scoping, comprehensive scoping document is on the Mid-Atlantic Council's webpage. Next slide, please, Maya. So we received a number of comments from the questionnaire regarding the objectives. In our analysis, we coded the responses into the following categories, and there are 6 categories of comments. So about 100 comments suggested changes to the objectives. Some of the examples of changes to the objectives can be seen in box number 1. Many commenters supported the existing objectives with no suggested changes. Box 3, there are examples of commenters who suggested adding additional objectives, and some of those additional objectives are shown in box 3. And then in box 4, there are comments related to general considerations for the existing objectives. And then finally, for categories 5 and 6, there were other comments and some comments that were disapproving of the objectives altogether. And there'll be more details in that full report, as I said. Next slide, please, Maya. And then this slide just shows how the project objectives were changed. And then we made these suggestions, and then the Northeast Regional Coordinating Council, which is the overarching body of this initiative, approved the changes to the objectives. The first objective added East Coast and modified the word shifting to changing before stock availability and distributions. This acknowledges the possibility that stocks might not only shift in location, but also change in terms of availability and distribution. Many felt this was a broader term that would better apply here. For second objective, there were 3 slight changes. First, the term developed was changed to advance to reflect the fact that there are already many tools and processes in existence that management and other stakeholders could use in the governance and management of fisheries in the future. And second, that the requirement that fishery management strategies be robust was added in addition to flexible. Third, some comments were received about the need to include language regarding conservation and the support of fishing communities. As a result, the objectives were revised to say that fishery management strategies should have the goals of promoting both fishery conservation and resilient communities. Next slide, please, Maya. Also, from the questionnaire responses, we were able to pull together some categories of responses to the key questions that we asked about, and there are some examples here, not comprehensive, but give you an idea of the type of insight we received. So we asked about certainties. What important factors do we know will shape the next 20 years? Things like ocean temperature, ocean acidification, and sea level rise were raised. We also asked about uncertainties. What are the most important but unpredictable factors for the future? Responses included things like stock health and distribution, degree of habitat loss, rate of sea level rise, and impacts on fishing communities. We asked about wildcards. What developments could surprise us and radically reshape fisheries in the next 20 years? Responses included categories like impacts of storms, severe weather, changes in ocean currents, and fishery loss. Finally, we asked about the social, technological, economic, or political factors. Responses here included other ocean uses, loss of working waterfronts, changes in consumer demand, and a degree of stakeholder cooperation. I noted before there was not significant regional or stakeholder differences in the responses. The feedback from these questions will feed directly into the next step of the initiative, where we're going to undertake further research on the most frequently mentioned factors. So next slide, Maya. And so the exploration is our next step. And we are hoping to host, or we will be hosting, Driving Forces webinars this coming month, and then right into the beginning of March. And next slide, Maya. The purpose of these Drivers of Change webinars are threefold. First is to educate. We want to share information about and discuss the key drivers of change that could shape East Coast fisheries over the next 20 years. We want to engage with the stakeholders and provide an update and opportunity for participants to re-engage with the material. And then we want to focus. We want to set the scene for the next phases to ensure participants know the focus is on changing stock availability and distribution, and know that the overall goal is to identify implications for fisheries governance and management. Next slide, Maya. And this is just a list of the upcoming Drivers of Change webinars. There are 3 webinars coming up. The 3 topics are oceanographic, biological, and social and economic. We will have a keynote speaker for each of the topics, and then a panel that will engage with the speaker and ask questions. And then we'll have a short period of time for discussion and engagement with the panel and the keynote speaker. We're asking participants to familiarize themselves with background materials that we're going to create for each of the topic. Those will be posted to the web page that the Mid-Atlantic Council is hosting. They are 2 to 3 page information sheets on each of the 3 topics. And then we're asking those participants in the webinars, you know, what drivers are most important, which drivers are certain, and what drivers are uncertain, in order to best engage in the discussion. And these webinars are open to the public. We're sending out invitations to those people that asked to be continued to kept in the loop, that filled out the questionnaire, as well as sending out press releases to all of the different commission, council, and NOAA lists that we keep on hand for email. And then just to remind folks, then coming up after explanation, we'll still have the creation of the in-person workshops where we are going to construct and discuss the scenarios. After that workshop, we'll have the application phase. We haven't developed a specific plan for this, but we intend for this to start occurring next summer into the end of the year. And this is where we're going to figure out how to use the scenarios to identify actions and recommendations for the process. This is where discussions will happen regarding what all of this means, and where we'll produce some of the more concrete outcomes in addition to the creation of the scenarios themselves. We expect that this phase will likely involve much more participation from the management bodies, as well as some of the expertise about management and governance systems and how they can be improved upon or modified in light of the insights gained from the scenario development process. And then lastly, we have the monitoring phase. We plan this for early 2023. We don't have a lot of details about this yet, but we believe this phase would involve identifying key indicators of change that can be monitored into the future to help us adapt and respond to future changes. And just as a reminder, this is the web page that the Mid-Atlantic Council hosts for us on this initiative, where all of the information can be found on the work that has been done. It includes the previously recorded scoping webinars, the summary document, the links to the upcoming webinars, and additional background information. And that is all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Tony. Quite an ambitious undertaking, and I'm sure consumes a fair amount of your time and that of others. So we certainly appreciate you representing the commission in this. Any questions for Tony on her presentation?
I see no hands raised.
All right, I think you must have covered it in the level of detail folks needed. Well, good. All right.
Actually, Mr. Chair, Eric Reed has his hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question. I just, if people haven't had a chance to look at the presentation Tony just gave, there is going to be a discussion at the New England Council meeting next Wednesday in the afternoon. If that's another opportunity to perhaps ask a few questions. So just so you know, thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
And I think that Deirdre has more time allotted on the agenda, so her presentation might include a little more detail on some of the more specifics on scoping.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tony. All right. Well, we'll move on. Our next agenda item is some committee reports from Dr. Howell. So I'll turn it over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maya, are you able to bring up the presentation? Great, thank you. I'll start with the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership update, since this will be very brief. Next slide, please, Maya. The steering committee met virtually December 7th through 8th of last year, And we worked to revise the current National Fish Habitat Partnership RFP and also discuss the possible creation of a general ACFIP RFP. And this is in response to the infrastructure bill funding that is becoming available. We wanted to be prepared in case opportunities presented themselves where we needed to recommend projects with a quick turnaround time. We also started discussing the next conservation strategic plan and how to handle fundraising into the future. We had a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice discussion and started working on a diversity statement, as well as came up with actionable items that ACFIP can take in order to promote DEIJ. We re-voted in our current chair and vice chair. Kent Smith is continuing to serve as chair from Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and Jessica Coakley from the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council will continue to serve as vice chair. And the steering committee also reviewed our endorsement project success. Next slide, please. For our endorsed projects, we endorsed one since our last update, and it was an on-the-ground living shorelines project in North Carolina. And I reviewed the projects that ACFIP endorsed over the past 8 years. And for those that were endorsed over 1 year ago, all but one have been funded. This is a well over 90% success rate. And I just wanted to remind all the commissioners that ACFIP is able to endorse projects at any stage, including completed projects. And if you're interested in getting an ACFIP endorsement, I encourage you to visit our website to see the easy application process. Next slide, please. Our FY 2023 National Fish Habitat Partnership project applications were received. The announcement went out on November 16th via multiple communications outlets, and the deadline was last Wednesday, January 19th, to submit applications. We only received 3 proposals this year, and they were all for the Mid-Atlantic. And the feedback from past applicants that we spoke with so far seems to be the timing. There are a lot of RFPs out right now for on-the-ground restoration, and this one just wasn't as high up on the list as some of the other opportunities right now. So we're hoping that we can fine-tune this maybe for the next year, but that it seems to be a timing issue so far. Next slide, please. And as usual, ACFIP would like to thank the Commission for your continued operational support. I'll pause here in case anyone has any questions before I move on to the Habitat Committee update, if that's okay.
Any questions for Lisa on ACFIP?
No hands.
Excellent.
All right, very good. All right, go ahead, Lisa.
You. Great, thanks. Maya, can you please click the next slide? And now for the Habitat Committee report. Next slide. We have one new member, and this is Rachel Peabody from VMRC. Next slide. And the Habitat Committee met virtually on December 2nd of last year. We continue to work on the update to the Acoustic Impacts Habitat Management Series document. We will have this published by the end of this year. We also began working on our State Climate Change Initiatives update. We first released a report in 2016 and then a follow-up report in 2018, and a lot has taken place since that 2018 report, so we're working on an update to that. We continue working on fish habitats of concern. We had a discussion on harbor deepening and offshore wind, and we worked on editing the SAV policy. Next slide. For this SAV policy update, the policy board gave the Habitat Committee approval to develop a living shorelines policy that would be protective of submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, at the August 2020 policy board meeting. Living shorelines, as a reminder, when properly sited, are a great alternative to hardened shorelines. They incorporate vegetation or other natural soft elements. They promote shoreline stabilization, wave attenuation, erosion control, and improve fish habitat. Next slide. And the Habitat Committee supports the use of these softer, more ecologically beneficial means of protecting and stabilizing shorelines. However, some states are placing living shorelines in close proximity to SAV beds, which are directly or indirectly impacting this important habitat for many commission managed species. SAV is essential fish habitat and a HAPC, and the ASFMP updated our SAV policy in 2018, emphasizing its importance. Next slide. There was discussion at the August 2020 policy board meeting among commissioners to update the SAV policy that we already have instead of developing a new policy on living shorelines. And the Habitat Committee decided to take this route when addressing living shoreline impacts to SAV. We sent a draft of this updated policy to state directors on December 13th, and then we incorporated those edits and suggestions into a new version, which was included in the briefing materials for this meeting. Next slide. The major edits to that 2018 SAV policy, we updated the language in policy 2, which is protection of existing SAV and associated habitat, to clarify the commission's position on the installation of living shorelines and nature-based features over hardened shorelines when possible, but stated that SAV habitat and buffers should be a critical constraint that influences living shoreline or nature-based feature selection and design. Next slide. And that was the major edit to this SAV policy update. Next slide. We also made a couple of other more minor edits. We refined the definition of SAV and SAV habitat. The final language here clarifies the past definition and includes current or historic presence of SAV. Under policy 3, restoration of SAV, the policy was expanded to include confirmation that existing conditions can support restoration, in addition to reestablishing degraded conditions necessary to support SAV. So that was a minor adjustment, but I wanted to highlight it here. And we also had some changes in the introduction and throughout, including the new Chesapeake Bay SAV restoration goal, because that has since been updated since 2018, the status of Johnson seagrass in Florida, and coastal construction and algal blooms as major threats. And then there were just minor changes throughout for clarification and readability that did not change the content or the intent of the policy. Next slide, please. So with this, with these updates, we're hoping to have the edits approved today. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or would welcome a motion to approve it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Lisa, very much. I appreciate you guiding the committee on this. It's important to keep these documents alive and relevant. And I think these modifications have certainly done so. At this point, any questions for Lisa or comments?
Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a little bit nitpicky, and because I realize this document has been called the SAV policy for a long, long time. I support all of the edits. I think the Habitat Committee has done a great job recognizing the importance of this particular type of work. But since the Commission doesn't really have any authority here, the authority lies in different areas within the states. To me, this is more of a best management practices document than a policy. And I'm not suggesting we change the name now, just reflecting the fact that policy really doesn't seem to fit in this particular case. But with those statements in mind, I would make a motion to approve the updated SAV policy.
All right, thank you, Pat. Do we have a second to the motion?
Joe Cimino.
All right, second by Joe Cimino. Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, Pat. If you look up the definition of policy in the various dictionaries, it's kind of all over the place too. Sort of depends on the context for how you use it. I think you're, everybody understands what you mean by that, and there's policy, and then there's guidelines, and a variety of other descriptors for things that we use to help plot our course along a pathway. So any discussion on the motion?
I see no hands.
Any opposition to the motion?
No hands in opposition.
All right, we'll consider the motion approved unanimously. Thank you, Lisa, very much, and thank the Habitat Committee for their work on our behalf. We appreciate it. All right, in my zeal to move into the agenda, I overlooked the public comment part of our agenda. So at this point, I'd like to open up. Is there anyone from the public who'd like to make a comment?
I see no hands, and I'm just going to remind folks that red is raised. So when the arrow is red, that means your hand is up, just in case people are unfamiliar. And I still have no hands.
All right, so no public comment. We have no non-compliance findings to deliberate over. So is there any other business to come before the policy board?
I have Joe Semino.
All right, go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I'll be brief because I've already heaped my praises on Kirby and Savannah, even in her very brief time. But I couldn't let it pass without giving a big shout out to Mike Millard. I met him at the turn of the century. I won't say which one, but I met him as a young grad out of college, had a chance to work on the Hudson River with him, doing catch and release mortality for striped bass and shad, and was just about the best introduction a college grad could get to marine fisheries. So just want to say thanks and best wishes to him.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. If there's no other business to come before the policy board, we will stand adjourned.